If you open your mouth and I keep my mouth shut and you talk to the cops, then I get screwed and you go free. If both of us point the finger at each other, we both go to jail. So this is sort of what we see in the world today, is like this weird prisoner's dilemma of like, if I am open to falling in love, but you are not, then I'm screwed. And the vice versa is also true. So the safest play that everyone comes up with is the situationship. Alrighty, we're finally doing it. Dr. K is talking about situationships. Now, a lot of people who hear that term may sort of rebel against it, right? You may say, but Dr. K, you don't know my life. You don't know how hard dating is. You don't know why situationships really do work for me. And I don't doubt that a lot of people feel like they work for them in the moment, and that in a sense they do work for them. But as a psychiatrist, I think there's a big difference between something working for you and something being healthy. Because a lot of what I see in situationships today are adaptations to unhealthy situations, which don't necessarily make the adaptation completely healthy, right? I've also worked with people who watch a lot of pornography, play video games, and they'll say, hey, this works for me. Like smoking weed, that's probably the number one example. It really works for me. It helps me sleep. It helps me deal with my anxiety. It allows me to engage in friends with benefits relationships with other people who are also a little bit frisky because we all get high together. So I'm not saying that it doesn't work for you. I'm not saying that it isn't an adaptation to today's world. But when I work with people who are sort of engaging in situationships, friends with benefits relationships, I think one of the most important things that I've been able to offer them is an understanding of, first of all, why are we moving in this direction? Why does a situationship work for you? Why doesn't the traditional alternative of like falling in love not work anymore in today's world? So we have to have that discussion. The second thing that we have to do is talk a little bit about love, talk a little bit about the alternative, and sort of tunnel down and understand, how do human beings fall in love? How do human beings catch feelings with each other? And once we understand those two things, it will equip you to navigate these kinds of challenges, hopefully way better. So I'm not saying don't engage in a situationship. I'm saying like understand why you're engaging with it, understand what falling in love looks like. And lastly, we're actually going to give you all some really solid guidance on how to approach a situationship so that you can hopefully minimize your chance of getting hurt and maximize your chances of developing as healthy of a relationship as possible. Okay, so sound good? So like, hopefully that makes sense. So let's start with why situationships are on the rise. Navigating situationships can be a mess. I've worked with people who are in them because they actually do have feelings for the other person, but they're afraid of being rejected, so they kind of settle for what they can get. I've also worked with people who will use things like friends with benefits relationships to avoid dealing with their own fears of commitment. And that's the problem. Is the problem in here? Do you need to fix something in here, or do you need to fix something out there? And that's like literally why I started a coaching program, because I can teach all this stuff, but I'm a clinician, I'm a psychiatrist. I've seen the benefit of like patients coming into my office and the benefit of one-to-one work. So if you're struggling with these modern issues that therapy training doesn't really teach us how to deal with, really consider working with a coach, because they can help you sort of navigate, okay, what needs to be fixed in here so that you can act and behave and achieve your goals in the external world the way that you really want to. So if y'all are interested at all, definitely check out our coaching program. And now back to the video. The first reason I think is fractured attention. So if we look at it historically, right? So this is the way that human beings basically fall in love. And we have to understand some neuroscience and some physiology. So first thing is lust comes from the gonads. Now, gonads are testes and ovaries. So what do we mean by lust comes from the gonads? So what this means is that if you look at like human beings who are lusty, thirsty, horny, we use whatever term you want, that's basically governed by testosterone and estrogen. So if you look at like female libido is positively correlated with female testosterone. So the more testosterone you have in the system, whether you're a man or a woman, the more likely you are to experience lust. So we also know that, for example, like medical treatments that alter our hormonal balances of testosterone and estrogen will lead to a lack of like lustful thoughts. So if we look at someone who is like asexual but not aromantic, these people are capable of falling in love. They just don't have any desire for sexual relationships. What we tend to see more is hormonal abnormalities in that population, okay? So like being horny basically is governed by our gonads, is governed by testosterone, estrogen, ovaries, and testes. Now, love is a completely different thing. So the first thing that we've got to understand is the difference between love and lust. Lust comes from the gonads, and love comes from our dopaminergic circuitry. And these are two very different things, okay? So let's understand this a little bit. So the gonads are the ovaries and the testes, and these respectively produce estrogen and testosterone. So what we know about people who are lustful is that the biggest influence on whether you're thirsty, horny, lustful, call it whatever you want, actually has to do with your sex hormone levels. So you like testosterone, for example, the more testosterone you have, the more lusty you will be. And this is true of both men and women. So women who have very high sex drives, have a very high libido, are likely to have higher levels of testosterone than women who aren't. We can also look at situations like asexual but not aromantic people. So these are people who are capable of falling in love and forming emotional connections, being infatuated with others, but are not interested in sex at all. And that seems to correlate more to their sex hormones than their dopaminergic system. We'll get to the dopaminergic system in a second. So we also sort of know this because in medicine, when we do something that affects someone's, gonadal production of testosterone or estrogen. So for example, like if we give men like testosterone blockers to help them with hair growth or something like that, or help them with their prostate, then we'll see like changes in their level of libido. So we know that like libido and horniness basically comes from our testosterone or estrogen levels. I also work with this a lot as a psychiatrist when people come in and they'll say like, oh, I have like low libido. I'm not really like very horny. We'll sort of work a little bit on their testosterone system and hopefully that improves things. Okay. So first thing that we got to understand is that lust is governed by our level of sex hormones. Now, what about love? So love comes from our dopaminergic system, our mesocortical circuit, our nucleus accumbens. So this is when we sort of think about the addictive stuff like dopamine, like we get addicted to video games and addicted to drugs and things like that. Love is also like an addiction, right? Like you're addicted to this person. The more, like when you're apart from them, you crave them. So remember that the nucleus accumbens gives us three things. It gives us a sense of pleasure, it gives us a sense of craving, and it gives us a sense of behavioral reinforcement. And what we see in people who are in love is all three of these things. So there are studies that show that even being in the presence of someone that you love causes a release of dopamine. So just being like near them, and you may have seen these people, right? They're increasingly rare in modern society today, where it's like two people are like holding each other's hand and they're like gazing into each other's eyes and they're so deeply in love. And it's like, what are these people doing? Like they're not doing anything. They're just sitting there like looking at each other. Like, how is this? But there's a steady stream of dopamine being pumped in out of their nucleus accumbens that is so engaging for them, right? So the other features of love are similar to dopamine. So when they're apart, they will have an induction of a craving, right? So like, oh, I crave this person. I need to touch them and hold them and smell them and feel them. I just can't wait to see them again. So there's a very strong craving. There's a very strong behavioral reinforcement. And we also see something called kindling. So this is an important like neuroscientific principle of addiction. Sometimes in the brain, we develop something called tolerance, which is like when, if I drink some alcohol and then over time, let's say I have one drink and I get drunk. Over time, what's going to happen if I continue to drink is I will develop a tolerance. So one drink won't get me drunk, then I need 2 drinks, then I need 3 drinks, then I need 4 drinks. And the reason for that is that as my body gets this thing called alcohol, it does not think alcohol is a nutrient. So what it tries to do is metabolize it, right? So literally we have these enzymes in our liver that start to ramp up and break this crap down. It's like, oh my God, we are getting this toxin in our body. So how do you know whether the body thinks something is a toxin or something is a nutrient? If it thinks it's a nutrient, it stores it, right? If it thinks it's a toxin, it breaks it down. That's how you know what's healthy or what's unhealthy. Does it get stored or does it get broken down? So generally speaking, our body, as we get some kind of substance, we will develop a tolerance to it because our enzymes ramp up. So we break it down faster. We develop resistance against alcohol. But there's another really interesting principle in addiction, which is actually the opposite, which is something called kindling. So this is when we get, 1 unit of cocaine, let's say, and it gives us a certain amount of pleasure. But the second unit of cocaine that we get actually gives us more pleasure than the first. So kindling is sort of an increasing of sensitivity to the signal, okay? So this is sort of what we see when we look at like studies on love, is we see this kindling effect where you spend a little bit of time with them, and then like you spend a little bit more, like a little bit is like, oh, like there's something going on here. Like what is this? There was like, are you feeling what I'm feeling? Like, what is this? I'm taking, I thought we were just friends. Like, what is, oh my God. And then you spend a little bit more time with them and you're like, oh my God, this is something is going on. Oh, what is this? What is this feeling? Do you feel the way that I feel? And so over time, there's a kindling. So there's an increase in sensitivity. So I'll show y'all like a good example of this, okay? There's a great paper about what fuels passion. So an integrated review of competing theories of romantic passion. So like what the hell causes passion? So one really interesting theory of passion is something called the rate of change in intimacy model. So if you've ever fallen in love, this won't be surprising, but let's look at the source and trajectory of passion. So according to this model, passion results from increases in intimacy that occur, for example, as romantic partners learn new details about one another, share new experiences, and communicate affection toward one another. Thus, this model suggests that when intimacy is rising quickly, passion will be high. In contrast, when intimacy is stable and no longer increasing, passion will be low, okay? Given that there is often only so much information to be learned about a partner, intimacy often plateaus in relationships, at which point passion starts to decline. So I think this is a really great model, and I'll kind of explain a little bit more about what this means. So basically, if we think about our experience of falling in love, we fall in love a little bit, right? And remember, this is governed by dopamine. And so then we start to develop this sensitization. So we become more sensitive to this other person. So then, we spend 1 hour with them and we experience 1 unit of love. We spend 2 hours with them, we experience 4 units of love. We spend 4 hours with them, we experience 8 units of love, or 10 units of love, or 12 units of love. So oftentimes when we fall in love, there's this sense of like running away with things, right? And that's mediated by this dopaminergic sensitization kind of thing. And then the other thing that we sort of know about this rate of change of intimacy model of passion and falling in love is that at some point, the intensity stops increasing. So it's like as we are falling more in love with this person, our level of passion towards them increases. But at some point, things start to level out, and then passion actually becomes stable or even extinguishes. And this is usually what happens when people fall in love very quickly, is that they also like fall out of love very quickly, right? There are very few lucky instances of people like falling like really hard for each other. Like, oh my God, I love this person so intensely for 1 month. And then for the next 40 years of their life, like that's the way that they feel about them. So over time in healthy relationships, what happens is this model of passion then gets like sort of, there are other models of passion, which we'll talk a little bit about. And then so you basically have to replace this model of love and intimacy and passion with another more sustainable model. My point here is that like if we look at, how human beings fall in love, this is just important to understand. Because when we look at situationships, we can see why they're on the rise if we consider some of these models. So if we look at situationships, the first thing to understand is that they involve a fracture of our attention. So in order for all of these models of love to happen, we require a very intense attentional connection. So we can't sort of have passionate love for each other unless I'm totally into you and you're totally into me. We spend time together. It's I sensitize, you sensitize. We spend more time together. I sensitize, you sensitize. So like I remember my first date with my wife of today was like, I didn't even know it was a date, but like, I took her out to lunch, okay? And like we went to lunch, and then afterward I was like, hey, you want to grab some bubble tea? And she was like, sure. And then we grabbed bubble tea. And then I was like, hey, you want to like go hang out for a little while? And she's like, sure. And then I was like, hey, I'm going to a friend's place for dinner. Do you want to join me? And she's like, sure. And then we were like, hey, do you want to have a couple of drinks? And she was like, sure. And so like our first date was like 12 hours, and it was supposed to just be lunch, and it wasn't even like a date. It was just like we were going to go to lunch, and it ended up lasting the whole day. So there is a mutual attention which is required for this sensitization and acceleration of passion. What's happening in the world today? There is no mutual attention. We're fucking texting, and we're texting with like 6 people at the same time because we're hedging our bets, right? This is what we're doing. So you're texting with one person, they're texting with you and 4 other people. So now that there is a diffraction of our attention, or a diffusion of our attention, actually a fracturing, not diffraction, fracturing of our attention between 5 or 6 different people, there isn't an opportunity to fall in love. We are not creating the requisite requirements for this sort of ignition of passion. So I think a big part of why situationships arise is because people aren't creating situations in which our biological drivers to fall in love are actually able to manifest. So everyone has their split attention, and if we have the split attention, we can't sort of start this snowballing effect of falling in love. Now, the next thing that we need to ask ourselves is, why on earth is everyone having split attention? So I think if you look at the world today, there's like a loneliness epidemic, there are dating problems, we have fertility problems, like something is going on. So there are 2 major things to consider. The first is that our capacity to fall in love is impaired. So why is that? Well, that's because it's governed by dopamine, right? So we talked about like this dopaminergic system, which results in like people falling in love. And so if we're tampering with our dopamine system through social media, through video games, through the internet, through drugs, through pornography, then like those 2 things are going to affect each other because they come from the same part of the brain, right? It's like if I use this hand to play video games and I use this hand to, I don't know, like cook, and I damage the hand, my capacity to play video games and my capacity to cook will be like messed up, right? Because there's a common component. So all of this dopaminergic stuff that is happening in our brain, like that affects our brain, like video games and porn and things like that, are negatively impacting our capacity to fall in love. So as our dopaminergic circuits get exhausted, or we develop tolerance through things like social media and doom scrolling, we just feel numb and empty, and then we can't really fall in love. So this is the first thing that's going on, is that human beings aren't capable of love in the way that they used to be. And if you're out there dating in the world today, like, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's hard to fall in love. Second thing that's going on is we've got this like terrible prisoner's dilemma kind of thing going on, where if you're out in the world today, the last thing that you want to do is fall in love. Forget about for a second, like, you can't fall in love. You don't even want to fall in love, right? Because here you are talking to someone on an app, and you, dumbass that you are, make the mistake of falling in love. And what happens? You fall in love, but they're talking to 5 other people. Now you're in love with someone who is not in love with you. Why aren't they in love with you? Maybe it's something wrong with you, and this is a huge problem that people have. They're like, oh my God, why don't people like, why am I always the one who's loving them and no one ever loves me back? Am I broken in some way? I don't think you're broken in some way. I think their brain does not exist in an environment where they are conducive to falling in love, because they have this fracture of attention. So you're falling in, and this is the worst thing that can ever happen today, right? Like, and tell me I'm wrong, by all means, is you fall in love with someone who doesn't give you attention. Their attention is fractured between 4 or 5 different people. And this is a terrible idea. And since we know that now the default appears to be that everyone is talking to more than one person at the same time, because you're looking for that spark, right? But in the way that you are looking for the spark, you are destroying the capacity for the spark to ever be lit. So like, this is the huge problem. So now what happens is we create this vicious cycle of, I'm looking for love. I didn't find it over here. Didn't find it over here. I tried dating this person. That didn't work out. So now I'm going to look for like love with like more people, right? So I need to find the right person. So now I'm talking to 5 people at a time. I'm talking to 6 people at a time. I'm going to install Tinder, and I'm going to install Bumble, and I'm going to install Hinge. I'm going to do all 3 of these. So we're doing more and more and more. And the more that we do, the more that we fracture our attention. The more that we fracture our attention, the harder it becomes to fall in love. And then this goes back to the other thing, where once again, if you make the mistake, we don't want to do that. If you make the mistake of falling in love, then you're screwed, because the person that you're in love with is now talking to 5 other people. And this is not going to end well. So then what do? How do we adapt to the situation? We say, okay, I don't want to fall in love, right? That's the only way you can protect yourself. And now we have a bigger problem, because now on the other side of the table, there is someone who is ready to fall in love with you. But what do you say? You say, I don't want to fall in love. No, falling in love is dangerous. Therefore, no love. That is why I'm going to talk to 5 or 6 different people. That is why I'm going to engage in a situationship. So there's this crazy like prisoner's dilemma going on of like, okay, both of us are getting interviewed by the cops. If I say, yeah, I didn't do anything illegal and I don't blame you, if both of us keep our mouth shut, we both go free. If you open your mouth and I keep my mouth shut and you talk to the cops, then I get screwed and you go free. If both of us point the finger at each other, we both go to jail. So this is sort of what we see in the world today, is like this weird prisoner's dilemma of like, if I am open to falling in love, but you are not, then I'm screwed. And the vice versa is also true. So the safest play that everyone comes up with is the situationship. Now let's talk a little bit about statistics around situationships, because this is insane. So previous researchers around the prevalence of friends with benefits among college students to be anywhere between 51 and 60% at one time or another, right? So this is a study from this paper. So this study came out in 2009. That showed that 51 to 60% of college students were in friends with benefits relationships. That's what they used to call situationships. So situationships are absolutely on the rise. And a big part of it is because we're playing this like weird game of footsie where no one wants to fall in love because it's dangerous to. And so everyone is kind of like taking it like they're trying to play it safe, right? They don't want any kind of commitment. So back in 2009, the number was somewhere between 51 and 60%. The truth of the matter is, like, I don't know what the numbers are right now. It's really hard to find high quality research on friends with benefits relationships or situationships for a couple reasons. The first is that, like, so we understood what was going on. Like, you could do research over the course of 10 years, like in 2010, because things were relatively stable. But the rate of change in the world, the rate of just basic instability in the world has gone up so much that old figures don't really map onto the present. So there's like pre-COVID dating, which between 1990 and like 2020, there were like general trends that you could observe. Then COVID happened and dating got really, really messed up. And now we're living in the post-COVID era where there's like this reorganization of dating and relationships. So I don't really know what the number is now. All I know is that people are lonelier. People are getting married later. Fewer people are getting married. We're seeing some of these newfangled like developments like situationships, polyamory, or whatever, which is human beings' adaptations to like whatever the fuck we're living in today. So why are situationships on the rise? First of all, our dopaminergic circuitry is getting messed up. We need sustained attention. We're not having sustained attention. We're trying to hedge our bets, right? We don't want to fall in love with someone who's not going to fall in love with us. And so what we end up with is like this sort of desire for friendship without a romantic commitment, right? And plus sex, because our testosterone levels are fine. So if our testosterone levels are fine, then we want to, we're thirsty and we need to get that taken care of. But we're very concerned about commitment. And now we get to the second big reason why I think situationships are on the rise, and that's because no one knows what to expect from the future. So the rate of instability in the world is skyrocketing. The rate of uncertainty in the world is skyrocketing. You don't know where you're going to be a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. You have no idea about yourself, let alone someone else. So human beings, and if you look at studies on situationships, like there's a really interesting statistic that if you look at people who are interested in engaging in situationships, their number one priority in life is financial independence. So they're sort of like looking out for themselves, right? And that's not a bad thing. I think it's an adaptation of the uncertainty of the world. And so what's happening is people are like, look, I can't worry about integrating my life with your life, let alone anyone else's life. Like, I have no idea if I'm going to pick someone who has all these hidden red flags. I can't plan a life with someone else. It's hard enough to plan my own life. So I got to look out for me. I got to stabilize myself. People are like the rate of the age of first home purchase is skyrocketing, and it used to be in their 20s, and now it's like not even possible for many human beings. So like there's just so much uncertainty in one person's life that the idea of like forming, like hitching your cart to someone else's horse sounds really, really scary. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the world. Therefore, like, planning my life with someone is a big no-no. So instead, what is a lot safer is having a friend, right? So a friend is someone who like, I have my finances, you have your finances. We're not going to tangle ourselves up with things like children. We're not going to tangle ourselves up with things like marriage. We're not going to bind our lives together. We are going to be friends, and then we're going to add a sexual component, because the normal way, not normal, let's say historical, way that sexual relations happen involved love and romance and things like that. And this is sort of actually really consistent with another theory of romantic passion, which I want to share with y'all. So let's take a look at this, okay? So this is the same paper on what fuels passion, an integrated review of competing theories of romantic passion. So there's another model called the self-expansion model, okay? So we're going to take a look at what the self-expansion model of passion is. Aaron and Aaron's self-expansion model suggests a different source of romantic passion. Rather than passionate feelings arising from a state of uncertainty or increases in intimacy, Aaron and Aaron describe passion as arising from individuals expanding their sense of self through their romantic partner or self-expansion. So according to this model, individuals possess a fundamental motivation to expand the self. An essential pathway to do so is by forming relationships in which they include the other in the sense of self, a process in which individuals self-expand by taking on their romantic partner's resources, perspectives, and characteristics. Okay, so what does this mean? So human beings have this fundamental desire to grow, right? We don't like being stagnant. We want to progress in life. So in the early stages of progression, it's things like, I'm going to go to school, I'm going to get a degree, I'm going to get a job, I'm going to get a house. Like, there are certain ways that you can expand your sense of identity by adopting different characteristics about yourself, by adopting competencies. I'm going to become a doctor, right? So if we look at like human beings, they want to progress. So I want to be a student, then I'm going to be a medical student, then I'm going to be a doctor. So this is like, we're completing quest chains here, okay? And at some point, the expansion of the self doesn't require, but basically require, that doesn't technically require, but in the default way that we continue to level up ourselves is by incorporating another human. So I am Alok. I am a gamer. And at some point, I become a husband. It becomes a part of my identity. Then I become a father. So if I were to ask, the average person on the street, do you believe that, single, married, parent, is that a progression? I think most people would agree. So this is where another like sort of theory of passion and why we fall in love, where passion comes from, is like, this person becomes part of me. And when you talk to people who are like married, right, like they'll say like, we are a unit. It's like one soul that is split between two bodies. It's this very like Romeo and Juliet, like we are creating something. We are able to arrive at a tier of ascendancy of humanity when we combine two people. It's two lives that are sort of intertwined and combined. So this is the expansion of self model. This is a model that people don't like anymore, right? This model is scary in today's world. I don't want to get entangled with your crap because I don't know what your crap is. I don't know if I can rely on you. I don't know if you're going to disappear. We're friends, but you're also friends with other people. Like, I don't know if I can put all my eggs in this basket. So there's a lot of fear that I see with people where there's a lot of uncertainty in your life, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the average person's life. There's a lot of uncertainty in your friend's life. And it's like, if we're trying to figure out what the hell to do in this world, the last thing that we want to do is increase the uncertainty exponentially by roping in someone else into my life. So I think the result of this is that people are afraid to fall in love. People are afraid to commit to each other. Therefore, we sort of enter this situationship where it's like, okay, we can be friends, but your life is over there. My life is over here. I get to do what I want. You get to do what you want. And occasionally we'll, get together and smash. So I'm seeing this sort of increase in uncertainty that I think is really resulting in the desire for situationships. Now, the question becomes, but Dr. K, you said on balance, you think it's unhealthy. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about why I think that is. If we look at the way that human beings interact with each other, sure, we can have an adaptation to society, but then there is a part of our biology which doesn't evolve nearly as fast. Right? So if we look at things like, anytime we have sex, if we cuddle, we will, or even just human contact and cuddling especially, releases oxytocin. And so when we release oxytocin, we start to form emotional bonds. So like, I don't know if this makes sense, but evolution has like tried to make us fall in love. Evolution has been like, okay, if I just give these fuckers dopamine when they fuck, then like, that ain't going to work, right? So like maybe a couple million years ago, there were two types of mammals. There were mammals who emotionally bonded after having sex. And then there were mammals who didn't emotionally bond after having sex. And then what happened is the mammals that emotionally bonded after sex are the ones that had more successful offspring. So now that like, even though I'm not feeling horny anymore, right? And so if you sort of think about things like post-nut clarity, without oxytocin, post-nut clarity would be like too powerful of a factor in our brain. Like I have sex with you and now it's like, wait, what am I doing? This is a terrible idea. If all I have is post-nut clarity, I'm out the door. So evolution is sitting there and it's like, well, fuck, this guy's going to bail with post-nut clarity. We need another system to rope this person in. And if we can rope this person in post-nut clarity, then this person will stick around while their wife is pregnant and maybe a little bit less attractive, a little bit more moody, a little bit more demanding. And they're going to put up with all this stuff for some reason, falling in love. And then if they do that, they'll be a dad, and the children will grow up happy and healthy, and they'll be able to more able to procreate, right? So the evolution is like sitting there, and it's like in the character creation screen, and it's like making humans, and it's like, okay, we've got post-nut clarity, but we need something else. That's where emotional bonding comes in. And it's like, okay, we're going to create this thing called oxytocin. And when people have sex, we're going to create emotional bonds because that's going to be evolutionarily useful. So this is where situationships become problematic, because all of these factors are active in a situationship. So you can make whatever agreement. You can sit down with another human being and say, okay, we're going to agree not to catch feelings. Where like your oxytocin system doesn't really care about that. Your limbic system doesn't really care about what you decide to do, right? You can decide, hey, I'm no longer going to eat pizza. And your like leptin ghrelin system is like, yeah, I don't care about that. We're going to crave pizza. Get us some pizza. So this is like a big problem with situationships where people will come up with rules, right? And there's even like evidence that shows that people are unhappy with the rules of situationships. So let me show y'all a quick bit of data around that. So people will agree to things when they sort of have a friends with benefits relationship or a situationship, but oftentimes this is harmful to one party over time because maybe people catch feelings. So men tend to focus more on the sexual aspect of friends with benefits relationships, while women emphasize the emotional connection, leading to potential mismatches in expectations. So this is really interesting, right? So this paper is a little bit dated, so things may have changed. My perception is that things have changed now, but oftentimes there is a mismatch between sexual expectations and emotional expectations. But this is what I thought was really interesting. Notably, women are more likely to avoid entering into similar relationships in the future, suggesting some dissatisfaction with the emotional dynamics over time. So this is where like the biology really comes in. So when I said I think that they're on balance unhealthy, what I mean by that is a relationship involves two people. So even if it's working for you, the question is it working for the other person? If it's not working for the other person, I would say on balance, it's unhealthy, right? So when I do like couples counseling, the rare days that I do, I'm thinking about the relationship as a whole. Is the relationship healthy? The relationship being healthy doesn't mean that one partner is unhappy and one partner is happy. Like that's not how it works, right? Like we're looking kind of at the whole unit. And that's precisely the problem with situationships, is that you're not sort of thinking about the other person. There's an intentional shutting off of the other person's emotional feelings. Now, I know that those of y'all who engage in situationships will say, but I don't do that. We have all these conversations. We'll get to that. So there are hopefully healthier ways to do it. My point is, if you look at some of this data, you'll find that, there can be situationships can be healthy at the beginning. We can all agree to things. But then like biology enters the picture and people do end up catching feelings and things do end up getting complicated, right? And then people do end up having their feelings hurt. And then people are like, and this study suggests that women are less likely to engage in situationships. So if they engage in one, they are less into it usually in the future. That I think is, like I said, I think that dynamic is changing. I don't trust that data to be stable over time. So there's even studies that show that like gut microbiome. So when we kiss, we exchange bacteria. Bacteria travel into our gut, and then they start to do things like produce neurotransmitter precursors. Like they'll produce serotonin building blocks and, monoamines and things like that. There are even studies that show that when you break up with someone, like it alters your gut microbiome. It alters so there's a connection even between like your gut microbiome a breakup, and your mental health. So these kinds of physical relationships that we're engaging in are doing things to our mental health, our levels of inflammation, our levels of connection. And this is mediated by even things like kissing and gut microbiome. It's not just oxytocin and cuddling, because some people have sort of figured that out, right? They've said like, okay, we're going to like have sex, but no cuddling, no spending the night. They'll come up with these rules. My point is that like you may have come up with that rule, but do you understand all of the mechanisms through which human beings fall in love? Do you understand that kissing may lead to a gut microbiome change, which will change your capacity to fall in love, will change your capacity to, feel good about yourself, will increase your stress, decrease your stress. The body is so incredibly complex, and the majority of people who are having sex with each other have no idea about any of these systems, right? I don't even know about most of these systems. I mean, we don't know most of this stuff. So this is why I think on balance, they're like somewhat unhealthy, because we're playing with a lot of evolutionary mechanisms. We're not quite sure what the effects are. This is sort of where we are today. I think it's reasonable that human beings, want situationships. I think it's hard to plan your life. I think it's hard to plan your life with someone else. It's hard to commit to someone when they may not be committing to you. We're in this whole prisoner's dilemma. And so at the end of the day, this is, I think, why situationships arise, right? Like they're there for a reason, a very good reason. It's because it's really hard to fall in love and we don't want to anyway. So situationships are a thing. They're sort of an adaptation to the dopaminergically messed up, uncertainty-driven relationship situation that we live in today. And so, like I said, I think on balance, they're unhealthy because there's like another thing that I didn't really get into, which is that oftentimes, so I've done a fair amount of work with sex workers. And one of the things that we sort of don't really acknowledge is that in order to successfully become a sex worker, you have to limit certain parts of yourself. You have to cut off or numb these emotional aspects. So we don't want oxytocin forming bonds and things like that. So one other problem that I see a lot in situationships is that they can negatively impact your future potential for romantic relationships. Not always. I'm not saying that you're doomed if you're in a situationship, but generally speaking, when we're in a situationship, we are engaged in like a sexual relationship, there may be a friendship, and then we have these biological processes that are ongoing. So as these biological processes are ongoing, we will generally speaking do things like catch feelings, stuff like that. And then now we're in trouble because we said we were going to be friends with benefits, but now I have feelings for you. So then in order for me to maintain the friends with benefits relationship, I have to practice or condition numbing myself. I need to shut off these love signals. And what I've seen working with sex workers is that like when they try to enter into a romantic relationship, they have to undo some of that conditioning. For some people, it's pretty easy. For some people, it causes lots of problems. And the really dangerous thing about that is that not oftentimes, but sometimes the really tragic cases are cases where there is a really potentially a good relationship. But something about the existence of your prior relationships as a sex worker or even friends with benefits can be threatening to future partners. You have this kind of emotional numbness. You have this fear of falling in love. Like there's all kinds of baggage that comes with situationships that I think a lot of people don't realize, right? We think that situationships, the whole point of them is to free ourselves from baggage. But I don't know how to say this, y'all, and maybe you know this. But when you're in a situationship with someone and they catch feelings for you and then you start dating someone else, that is a mess, okay? So situationships are not free of their conditioning. They're not free of the way that they change you. They're not free of even emotional baggage because as some of y'all unfortunately know, you may end up catching feelings for someone. So all that being said is fine. Now the question becomes, okay, these are a reality. They exist in the world today, right? So how should you navigate them in the healthiest way? And this is where a lot of the people that I've worked with don't think about this stuff before they engage in a situationship. Usually like a situationship is like something that's organic. It's like I'm going to hang out with my friend. We're feeling kind of frisky. It's late at night. Neither of us is dating anyone. Hey, like, what do you think about? And then you have maybe a brief conversation. Maybe you don't. Maybe you just start kissing and then you fuck and then you have a conversation. Hey, I'm not looking for anything. Like I value you as a friend. And you're like, okay, I value you as a friend. But when you say I value you as a friend and I'm not looking for anything, How do you know that the other person isn't just meeting you where you're at? How do you know that the other person is even honest, maybe does want more, but now feels embarrassed because y'all are friends? And like, it gets so complicated so quickly. One of the things that I've never heard of anyone doing is a literature search on the best ways to produce healthy friends with benefits relationships, and then making a 7-point bullet list of things to discuss with your partner so that you can hopefully minimize damage and have the healthiest relationship you can build. And that's what we're going to do. Let's take a look at the consideration. So if you want to engage in a friends with benefits relationship, look, you do you. Dr. K doesn't know what dating is like nowadays. At the same time, let's try to equip you with a couple of guidelines to try to make situationships as healthy as possible. So first thing is that what we want to do is, like, from the get-go, have conversations about how the relationship will function. Oftentimes, these are actually a negotiation. So what we're actually doing is, like, thinking about, okay, like, how often are we going to see each other? Like, what does this mean for, like, you know, so like there's kind of like this negotiation phase, which can feel really awkward, but it's important to sort of from the get-go try to establish some ground rules. I'm not saying that the ground rules should be a particular way. That's for you to figure out. My point is that having an explicit conversation about ground rules is probably something that will improve the health of the relationship. So then I think these conversations don't happen often enough. So is the relationship exclusive? What does this mean for having sex with other people? I've seen all these different variants. Some is like, okay, the friends with benefits relationship, this usually is true for people who have friends with benefits relationships that are like years long, where it's like, okay, while neither of us is dating, we can have sex with each other. But the moment that one of us enters into a relationship, this kind of thing stops. So, and if you're in a friends with relationships, friends with benefits relationship, if you're in a situationship, does this mean that I can have a situationship with other people? So there's still like discussions around sexual exclusivity, which are important. I think it's really important as a doctor to talk about sexual health, sexual safety, and contraception, right? So are y'all getting STI tested before you have sex? Are y'all using condoms? Are y'all using contraception? Like talk about that stuff ahead of time, okay? You know, someone getting pregnant or someone getting a sexually transmitted infection is a really, really, really great way to screw up a situationship. Communication, honesty about feelings and intentions regarding the relationship, and frequency of contact. This is huge, man. Like, we should do this for relationships too. What is the expectation around frequency of contact? If we're fucking, does that mean I have to text you every day? Because I've seen plenty of situationships where if we're smashing, suddenly there are all these expectations around texting and communication, and people may get upset. So the other thing that I strongly, strongly, strongly encourage you to do is to be honest in the early phase of the conversation. People are so dishonest in the first phase of the situationship conversation, because the truth of the matter is I do have some feelings for you. But you're approaching me with a situationship. I have a little bit of romantic attraction to you. I don't want to reject you. I value our friendship. I want to see where things go. I maybe even am suppressing the romantic attraction that I have for you because I'm scared of it, because there's a lot of uncertainty. And so oftentimes deception is like in the first conversation. Please don't do that, right? You're signing yourself up for a lot of hurt down the road, and be as honest as you can. Next thing that we're going to talk about, see, this is something that almost never gets talked about explicitly. Is this secret? Are we telling people? Are we not telling people? You know, this is another one. Huge, huge, huge. How long is this going to go on? What are the rules for ending it? I have never heard of a situationship where someone discusses this point at the beginning before it begins. The healthier ones will usually talk about it at some point, right? When does this end? But at least you don't have to figure out answers. So remember, the goals of these are not to like figure everything out and then sign a contract and stick with it, because the whole point of this is that your feelings and what you want and what works for you is going to change over time. But think a little bit about, hey, how long are we going to do this? Are we going to do this until one of us starts dating? Are we going to try this for like 6 months? Are we going to do this for a summer? Like, what's going on? Like, what happens to the relationship now and afterward? And so then there's an aspect of emotionality. Like, so what happens if we catch feelings? So if I start falling in love with you, like if one of us starts falling in love with each other, how are we going to address that? If one of us starts feeling jealous, how are we going to address that? Like what like, let's talk about the emotions that will inevitably arise. I'm not saying that they'll like take over, but like they'll pop up at some point, right? So having some prospective idea, some idea in advance that emotions may arise. And the last thing that's really important is a lot of people will prioritize the friendship over the sexual relationship, or they will claim to, where they'll sort of say, okay, like, what are the definitions of friendship? What are we prioritizing from a friendship perspective? What are we prioritizing from a romantic perspective, or not prioritizing? Like thinking and sitting down and really talking about what is the nature of our friendship. And so generally speaking, I think that the ones that I've seen that are healthier, and when I said on balance, I don't think they're healthy, a big reason for that is I don't think that these conversations are being had by most people, right? And even if they are being had, they're being had like too late, with too few considerations, with too much deception. And there are healthy situationships out there. There are absolutely healthy situationships, I think. But I think the ones that are healthy incorporate these kinds of things. I know it's kind of like a sticky topic. I know that people have a lot of strong feelings about it. But I think we tried to approach this in a really simple way, which is like, look, this is happening. We're going to approach it. We're going to try to explain it to you, try to understand the psychology of it, try to understand the neuroscience of it, and try to prepare you to move forward in the healthiest way possible. So good luck, because it ain't easy out there. I'll leave you with my favorite quote from the Three Musketeers. May God go with you, for no one else will. So I think this is exactly why we need to talk about this. So today's video is going to be a little bit...